A gloved hand pulled back the woodshed door at midnight. Snow fell off the hinges in a soft white line. The hinges groaned once. Inside, on a bed of straw, a girl knelt with her back to the door. She did not turn. She did not run. Her cupped hands held something small and dark and breathing. A saucer of warm milk sat between her knees. The man in the doorway did not speak for a long moment. He had come from the crypt because something he loved had not come home. He had come on foot through deep snow. He had come expecting a poacher. He had come expecting a witch. He had not expected this. The girl finally lifted her head. Her name was Anka. The scar across her throat caught the lantern light. What was she feeding? And why every night? Stay with me on this one. The tannery sat at the low end of the village, where the road turned to mud 6 months of the year and to ice the other 6. Anka worked the soaking pits. She scrubbed the salted hides. She carried the lime buckets that ate the skin off her knuckles. She fed the sour bran to the dogs that guarded the drying yard. She broke the ice on the rinse trough every morning before the bell rang from the chapel above the village. She slept in the woodshed behind the drying yard because Mistress Halla had locked the back room of the house 3 winters ago and never unlocked it. The villagers knew the shape of her before they knew her name. They knew the scar first. They knew the silence second. The fire that took her mother had also taken something out of her throat, and now her voice came out like a wet rasp when she pushed it too hard, so mostly she did not push it. They called her the burnt girl. They called her cursed. The children threw small stones at her back when she walked to the well, and the mothers did not stop them. Anka did not stop them either. She just walked. At the tannery, Halla worked her until her hands shook. Halla had taken her in as a girl of 9, after the fire, and Halla had reminded her of that every day since. A roof, Halla said. A bowl of stew. A pair of clogs in winter. And what did Anka give back? Slow hands. A face that drove off the customers. A throat the priest crossed the road to avoid. The stew was thin. The clogs had been Piotr's when he was a boy, and the wood had split along the heel. The roof, when she lay under it, leaked rain in the spring and snow in the winter, and Anka had learned which corner of the woodshed stayed driest and which corner the wind found first. She knew the count of the rafters above her by heart. She knew the small knothole in the back wall where a draft came through, and she had stuffed it with a twist of straw and her own breath every cold night for 3 years. Piotr was Halla's son. Piotr had courted Anka once, the summer she turned 17, before the scar went purple and before he started drinking the rye his father kept in the cellar. He had brought her a ribbon. He had walked her along the pine road. He had laid his palm flat against the scar one evening and told her it did not matter. Then the rye took him, and his mother got into his ear. And the courting stopped, and the shouting started. Now Piotr stood in the yard most nights with a clay cup in his fist and called her a witch. Now he threw clogs at the woodshed door if he saw her lamp. Now he laughed when his mother slapped her in the kitchen. She kept her head down. She kept her hands moving. That was the shape of her days when the bat came. It was the 3rd week of the worst winter in 20 years. The wind off the pines had a tooth in it. Anka had hung the last hide and shut the drying yard and gone to her shed to sleep. She lit the small tallow stub Halla allowed her. She knelt on the straw. She blew on her fingers. She heard a sound, a small dry click, like a fingernail on wood. She lifted the lantern. In the far corner, under the broken handle of an old rake, something black and folded and wet lay on its side. A bat. A small black bat. One wing bent the wrong way. A line of blood on the membrane where something had torn it. A breath in its small ribs, so fast she could see it in the lantern light. It looked at her with one black bead of an eye and did not flinch. Anka knew animals. She had grown up beside the tanner's dogs and the priest's goat and the half-feral cats that lived under the church floor. She knew when a thing was about to bite and when a thing was past biting. This one was past. She set the lantern down. She took the saucer she ate her supper off, and she poured a thumb of warm milk into it from the small clay jug she had carried in from the kitchen. She tore the soft white of the apple she had hidden in her pocket from Hala, and she crushed it on her thumb, and she set the saucer on the straw. She did not touch the bat. She just sat back and waited. After a long time, the bat dragged itself, on one wing and a small clawed foot, 6 inches across the straw. It put its mouth to the milk. It drank. It rested. It drank again. Inca watched it until the tallow stub burned down. Then she lay down on her side on her own straw, and she breathed slow so as not to scare it, and she fell asleep with her hand uncurled on the floor between them. In the morning the bat was still there, and the saucer was empty, and one small thing in her chest had moved a little. She fed it again the next night, and the next, and the night after that. She skipped her own supper twice that first week, so there was milk to spare. She did not feel hungry on those nights. She felt warm in a way she had not felt warm since her mother had been alive. She did not name it. Names belong to things that lived. This was not a thing that lived. This was a thing she was keeping warm until it did not. But it did not die. The bent wing stayed bent for a long time. Inca studied it by lantern light when the bat slept. She had stitched cuts on the tanner's dogs before, when Hala was not looking. She had set a sparrow's broken leg with a sliver of reed. She thought on the 7th night that she might try. She took a needle from the tannery, the fine one Hala used for the soft glove leather, the one Hala counted at the end of each week. She slid it into her sleeve. She took from her own scalp one long dark hair, pulled slow at the root so it would not snap. That night in the shed, she warmed the needle in the lantern flame. She took the bat in her left hand, as gentle as if it were a piece of melting frost. She laid the torn wing flat against her palm. She passed the needle through the leather of the wing on either side of the tear. She drew the hair through. She tied a knot her grandmother had once tied in a fishing line. The bat did not cry out. It looked at her. It did not look away. When it was done, she set it back on its bed of straw, and she sat against the wall and she shook for an hour. That was the first night she pushed her voice. She said one word. She said live. The bat lived. In the dark she put her hand back into her sleeve and slid the needle out and pressed it into the soft hem of her shawl, where Hala would never find it. She pressed her thumb against the spot for a moment, as if she could fix the needle there with her breath alone. Then she pulled the shawl tight around her ribs and lay back down, and listened to the slow, small heartbeat in the corner of the shed, and counted it until she slept. The wing healed crook, but it healed. By the 6th week, the bat could climb the rafter and hang. By the 8th week, it could drop and glide a short way. By the 10th week, it left the shed at dusk and was gone for an hour and came back. It always came back. It came back to the saucer. It came back to her hand. Sometimes it landed on the back of her wrist and folded its mended wing against her skin and slept there while she stitched a hide in the yard. The dogs in the drying yard stopped barking at it after the 1st week. The cats under the chapel floor stopped following it after the 2nd. The wind off the pines, when the bat was on her shoulder, did not seem to find her bones the way it used to. Inca did not have a word for any of it. She just kept the saucer clean and the milk warm and the apple in her pocket. The trouble started when Piotr saw it. He was crossing the yard at dusk with a clay cup in his fist, and the bat dropped from the rafter of the shed, and the bat landed on Inca's shoulder, and Piotr stopped in the snow with his mouth open. He went into the house. He came back with his mother. His mother came out with the priest. The priest was a small bent man named Doro. He had buried Inca's mother. He had baptized Inca with a wet thumb when she was a week old. He had crossed the road to avoid her every Sunday for 10 years. Now he stood in the tannery yard with a wooden cross in his fist and a face like a man who has been forced into a room he did not want to enter. He said the words, witch, familiar, pact, devil. Hala said the words after him. Piotr said the words after his mother. By full dark, half the village was in the yard. They held torches. They held axe handles. They held the iron candlesticks from the chapel. Inca stood in the shed door with her arms at her sides, and the bat hidden in the fold of her shawl against her ribs. They came into the shed. They tore the straw. They kicked the saucer across the floor, and the saucer cracked in two. They knocked down the rake. They knocked down the lantern, and the tallow stub guttered out. The bat dropped out of her shawl. It dropped low across the floor. It found a crack at the base of the back wall. It was gone before the priest could finish his next word. The villagers shouted. Piotr threw his cup against the wall. Hala turned in the middle of the floor and slapped Inca once, hard, across the scar. Then the wind shifted. The torches guttered. The priest looked over his shoulder at the dark line of the pines and crossed himself and said, "Enough." They left. Hala shut the shed door behind her. Piotr stood in the yard for a moment and then turned and walked into the house. The priest walked back to the chapel with his cross held against his chest like a man holding a wound closed. Inca knelt down on the broken straw. She picked up the two halves of the saucer. She set them on her palm. She wiped her bleeding cheek on the inside of her wrist. She wiped her hands on her apron. She breathed in. She breathed out. The shed was quiet. The lantern was out. The bat was gone. She sat there and she waited for her heart to slow. The door scraped open. Not Piotr. Not Hala. Not the priest. A tall man stood in the frame. Snow lay on the shoulders of his long black wool coat. He held no torch. He held no cup. His eyes in the dark were the color of wet slate, and they did not move from her face. The cold off him was a different cold than the cold outside. He said one thing. He said, "Where is Iska?" Inca did not know the name. She did not know the man. She knew the way she had known about the bat, that he was past asking twice. She lifted the broken saucer in her palm. She turned it so he could see the dried crust of milk on the inside. She lifted her other hand and showed him the tannery needle still pressed into the cuff of her sleeve. She lifted her chin and showed him the long dark hair tied off at the end, the one she had used for the stitch. The man in the coat went very still. He stepped into the shed. He did not duck for the low beam. He went down on one knee in the broken straw, and he was almost level with her now. He reached out slowly, and he took the broken saucer out of her hand as if it were the most fragile thing in the world. He said, "You have been feeding her." She nodded. He said, "Every night." She nodded again. He closed his eyes for a long second. When he opened them, there was a wet shine in them that he did not blink away. He said, "Her name is Iska. She is my sister. She has been a bat for 100 years. Believe me." That is what he said. Word for word. In a shed behind a tannery in a village at the edge of the pines, a man in a black wool coat went down on one knee in front of a scarred scullery girl and told her that the small black thing she had fed warm milk to every night for a winter was a woman cursed into wing shape a century ago. If you are still with me, hit that subscribe button. It tells me you want the rest of these. I will be honest with you. There is more to this one than I thought when I started telling it. Hit subscribe and let me keep going. He told her his name. He said Vale. Lord Vale of the Crypt of Sable Pines. The Vampire King, though he did not use that word in her shed. He said it the way a man says the name of his house. Quiet. Tired. As if it were a weight he had carried so long he had stopped noticing. He looked at her then. Properly. Slowly. The way a man looks at a piece of work he had been certain was beneath him and finds, on closer inspection, that it is not. He looked at the place on her cheek where the slap had bloomed red. He looked at the scarred throat. He looked at the long dark hair. He looked at the small clean hands that had not let go of the broken saucer. He said she did not come home. 3 nights ago she did not come home. I followed the pull on the bond into the pines. I followed it to this yard. I followed it to this door. He said, I thought I would find a trap. He looked around the shed. The broken saucer, the torn straw, the cracked lantern, the blood on her cheek where Hala had struck her. He looked at her scar, and he did not look away from it the way the others did. He said, "Who hit you?" She did not answer. She did not need to. He had ears. He said, "Get your coat." She had no coat. She had her shawl. She wrapped it. She wrapped the broken halves of the saucer in a corner of it. She wrapped the needle. She wrapped the strand of her own hair. He led her out of the shed. He led her past the tannery house. The lamp was lit behind the kitchen shutter. He did not look at it. He did not look at the chapel either. He led her up the pine road, where the snow lay deep and clean, and the only marks in it were the ones his boots made, and the small ones her clogs made beside them. A black bat dropped out of the pines, encircled them once and rose and disappeared. He said, "She knows." He led her down a stone stair behind the chapel that Inca had never seen, though she had walked past the chapel 1,000 times. The stair went down into the hillside under the chapel floor. The crypt was warm in a way that crypts are not supposed to be warm. Candles burned in iron sconces along the walls. The walls were dressed stone. The floor was swept clean. At the far end of the long room stood an iron cradle. Small, child-sized, polished, empty. He said this was hers. She slept in it as a girl. Before the curse. He said no court physician in 100 years has been able to finish what was started on her. The curse was a stitch that was meant to be closed. It was left open. She lives in wing shape because the stitch was never sealed. He said, "You finished the stitch on her wing." He looked at Inca with the slate-colored eyes. He said, "I am going to ask you to finish the other one." He told her what it would cost. He did not lie about it. He said, "The thread is one of your own. The needle is the one you carry. The hand has to be the one that fed her." He said, "If you do this, my sister will be a woman in that cradle for 1 hour. She will speak my name. And then she will choose." He said, "She will choose to stay woman or to go back to wing." He said, "If she chooses wing, the choice closes. There will be no third try." Inca stood at the foot of the iron cradle with the broken saucer in her shawl, and the needle in her sleeve, and the strand of her own dark hair in her palm. She thought of the first night. The small dry click in the corner of the shed. The folded wet thing under the rake. She nodded. He carried the bat to the cradle himself. He laid her on the small linen pillow. The bat looked at Inca. The bat did not look away. Inca took her one strand of hair. She warmed the needle in a candle. She knelt by the cradle. She drew the hair through the soft place at the base of the bat's small skull, the way the king showed her, slow, slow, and she tied the knot her grandmother had tied in a fishing line. Her hand did not shake the way it had shaken in the woodshed. Her hand was steady. She did not know why. Maybe because the bat was looking at her. Maybe because the man on his knees beside the cradle was not breathing. Maybe because her own scarred throat, for the first time in a winter, did not hurt. The candles dimmed. The crypt held its breath. The small black shape unfolded. It grew. It lengthened. The wing leather softened into the skin of an arm. The face came up out of the dark like a face coming up out of cold water. A young woman, no older than 20, with hair the color of a raven's back and eyes the same wet slate as her brother's. She lay in the cradle and she looked at the ceiling. She breathed. She turned her head slowly, and she looked at her brother on his knees beside the cradle. She said one word. She said, "Veil." He pressed his forehead to her hand, and he wept the way a man weeps who has not been allowed to weep for 100 years. Iska turned her head the other way. She looked at Inca. She reached out. She laid her hand against Inca's scarred throat the way a sister might lay a hand against a sister. She said, "Thank you." She said, "Brother, I cannot stay." She said it without crying. She said it the way a person says a true thing. She said, "The woman shape is too much pain now. I have been winged too long. Let me be wing. Let me be near you. Let me sleep above your chair. Let me wake when you wake. But let me be wing. He could not speak. He nodded. She looked at Inca once more. She said, keep him. Then she folded. The crypt dimmed again. The woman in the cradle became, slowly, a small black bat on a small linen pillow. The bat flexed its mended wing once. It lifted. It landed on the iron of the sconce above the cradle. It hung. It closed its eyes. Vale did not stand. He stayed on his knees beside the empty cradle for a long minute. Then he stood and he turned, and he looked at Inca and he said, stay. She did not answer in words. She held out the broken saucer in her open palm. He took it. He held the two halves together in his hand, as if he could press them whole again by holding them tight enough. He could not. He did not pretend he could. Above them on the crypt stair, a boot struck stone. A woman's voice, cold and old and used to being obeyed, came down the stair ahead of her. She said, Vale, do not let her speak the bond. Do not give the throne to a tannery girl. Lady Misk came down the last step. She had hair the color of pewter, and a coat of black fur, and a rolled writ in her hand. She had been his cousin for 200 years. She had been waiting to be queen for 150. She did not look at Inca. She looked at the iron cradle. She looked at the empty linen pillow. She looked at the small black shape hanging from the iron sconce above. And something in her face for a moment was not cold. For a moment, it was the face of a woman who had once known Iska as a girl. Then it closed again. Vale did not look at her. He looked at Inca. He said, do you want to leave? Inca shook her head. He said, do you understand what staying costs? She lifted her scarred hand. She laid it flat against his chest, the way Piotr had laid his palm flat against her scar a lifetime ago in a pine road in summer. She held it there. She said, with the rasp she did not push and did not hide, yes. He spoke the bond claim. He spoke it slow. He spoke it in the old tongue first and then in hers, so she would know what she was answering. Lady Misk dropped the writ on the swept stone floor. Lady Misk did not pick it up. Lady Misk turned and walked back up the stair, and the door at the top of the crypt closed behind her, soft, the way a door closes when there is nothing left to slam. Inca answered. One word in the old tongue. One word in her own. The candles brightened. The bat above the sconce opened one eye and closed it again. The bond was spoken. The bond held. The next morning Inca walked back down the pine road into the village. She wore the same shawl. She wore the same clogs. The snow had been broken by Vale's boots on the way up, and the print of those boots was still there beside the smaller print of her own. She crossed the yard. The tannery was quiet. The drying frames were empty. The kitchen shutter was closed. She went to the shed. She did not need anything large. She took the two halves of the broken saucer. She took the lantern. She took the small folded square of linen. The bat had slept on those first weeks. She took a feather she had found one morning on the straw. She took a tooth she had found on another morning and not known what it was. She put them in a small wooden box she had once kept buttons in. Hala was in the kitchen doorway when Inca came back into the yard. Hala did not speak. Hala did not lift her hand. Hala looked at the small wooden box and at the scarred throat and at the place on Inca's cheek where the slap had been, and Hala, for the first time in 12 years, looked down at her own hands. Piotr was sitting on the bench by the woodpile. He had no cup. He had no clay jug. He had a face like a man who had slept badly. He stood up when Inca crossed the yard. He took a step toward her. He stopped. He said, Inca. She looked at him. She did not speak. She did not have to. He saw the answer in her face. He sat back down on the bench and put his elbows on his knees and put his face in his hands and stayed that way. She walked past him and out of the yard. At the chapel, the priest was on the step. He had the small wooden cross in his fist again, but he was not holding it like a weapon now. He was holding it like a key he no longer needed. He made the sign. He looked at her, and then he looked at the line of pines above the village, and he said, "Lo, go in peace, child." It was the first soft word he had given her in 10 years. She took it the way a person takes a thin coin from a stranger. She did not weigh it. She just closed her hand around it and kept walking. The chapel bell did not ring as she passed under it. It was as if the bell itself, after 100 years of pretending it did not hear what lay under its own floor, had finally chosen to be quiet at the right moment. She walked on. The pine road opened up. The snow was clean. The wind off, the pines did not have a tooth in it that morning. The sun was a small pale coin behind a high gray sky. She walked the long curve up into the trees. She walked past the place where Piotr had once laid his palm flat against her scar. She did not stop there. She walked past the place where the children used to throw small stones at her back. She did not stop there either. She walked past the small stone where she had buried a sparrow at 12, the one she had tried to mend and had not been able to. She laid her gloved hand on the stone in passing. She did not stop. She kept walking. The pines closed over the road. The light shifted from the pale gray of the village to the deep blue-gray of the trees. The sound of the village fell behind her, one layer at a time. First the bark of the tannery dogs. Then the chapel bell ringing the second hour. Then the small far call of a child somewhere in the houses. Then nothing. She walked until the crypt stair came up out of the snow. At the top of the stair in the open door, Lord Vale stood without a crown. He wore the same long black wool coat. The shoulders were dark with melt where the snow had touched them and run. Above him, a black bat dropped out of the pines, circled the doorway once, and disappeared into the warm dark of the crypt. He held the door open. She walked through. The door closed behind her, soft, the way a door closes at midnight when the person who was on the outside is, finally, on the inside. She had fed it every night. Even the nights she had nothing for herself. Even the nights when her own hands were bleeding from the lime. Even the nights when Hala had thrown the saucer at the wall, and she had picked up the pieces and washed them and used them again. And one night at last, the door had opened for her too. And on the other side of it, a small black shape was already asleep above an iron cradle, waiting for her to come home.